Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoy your lunch. We're still waiting for a couple, some more people downstairs, but I think it's time for us to start the plenary section number 2. So on behalf of the organization board, I would like to introduce a little bit of information about the second keynote speaker. And I would strongly invite you to stay to the front or come close to the front so that we can have more people coming over and take a seat. Before I start the introduction of the second keynote speaker, we would like to remind you that after this section there will be some volunteers standing at the back of the gate. They will hand in a piece of paper where you can find the link to the feedback form. And they have a QR code. This is a new technology used in this conference, so you can scan the QR code and this will help you to get to the link where you can provide your feedback online. So once again, we appreciate your help and your feedback. It also noted that your telephone, your cell phone number will be collected for the purpose of, conducting the lucky draw. Some people are lucky enough to win the lucky prize of our convention today. So ladies and gentlemen, may I have the honor to introduce to you the second keynote speaker of our convention, Professor Deunan Freeman. And I'm telling you the truth that this is one of the 3 major scholars in the field, together with Professor Jacques Research and Professor David Deunan, who helps to enlighten me in the field of TESOL. I'm very much honored to provide some information about Professor Deunan Freeman. Professor Deunan Freeman is a professor of education, University of Michigan, where his work has focused on understanding and designing equitable professional development opportunities in ELT that are accessible to teachers across diverse teaching circumstances and contexts. He directs the Learning for Teaching project, a series of national research studies of ELT public sector teachers' experiences in professional development, conducted in Chile, Turkey, and Qatar. He is senior advisor on the EL Teaching Project, National Geographic Learning, which provides online professional development to ELT public sector teachers, and author, most recently, of Educating Second Language Teachers by Oxford, 2016. He is the past president of TESOL and a member of International Advisory Council for Cambridge ESOL, and immediate past chair of the International Research Foundation for English Language Teaching, also known as TIRF. We're going to listen to his presentation entitled, "Why Do Language Teachers Need to Use Other People's Ideas?" So please give a big applause to Professor Deunan Freeman.
So I think the sound should maybe be a little bit lower. Can you hear it in the back? It's okay? Wonderful. Well, thank you for that introduction. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Professor Cao for the invitation and VietTesol. Okay, and VietTesol as well. And also I want to thank my friends and colleagues at National Geographic Learning who have made it possible for me to be with you here today. So I want to talk with you today about some ideas. And you might have heard the statement that there is nothing as practical as a good theory. or as practical as a good set of ideas. So I hope I can convince you in the half an hour or 40 minutes we have of why thinking about how you use other people's ideas in your teaching is actually a very practical matter, and a matter that has a lot of ramifications for you as a teacher, educator, or policymaker. So my short answer to this question, why do language teachers, parentheses, need to use other people's ideas, is because we think of ourselves as people who use knowledge, not as people who make it. Teachers in language and in other subjects think of themselves as users of knowledge, not of generators or makers. So you could look at this image. You've seen this before. Do you see two faces? Do you see a vase in between? So you could say, using knowledge focuses on the space in between us as teachers and our students. Making knowledge focuses on how we think and how our students think. So what I want to argue with you, with you, in your presence, is that to shift our point of view from being users of knowledge to makers of knowledge, we really have to use a different set of ideas. Okay, so I've been working on the problem of how we use what we know to do what we do as teachers for a long time. It's kind of been a central question for me. We know things, and what we know drives the actions that we take with our students in the classroom. I'm interested in that relationship between what we see, what you see me doing now, and what we think, what's in my head, what I know. And that relationship is really a relationship about making knowledge. In other words, it's about what I'm going to call in this talk, knowledge for teaching. So my talk has two parts to it. The first part deals with how teachers use what they know, and you can guess the second part deals with doing, to do what they do. So using that phrase, how teachers use what they know to do what they do, I want to unpack an answer to this question of why we depend on other people's ideas when we teach. So let's start by thinking a little bit about what teaching knowledge is. When we look at what teachers know, we've defined this in three basic ways. You can think of these as generations. Initially, we thought that teachers needed to know stuff from literature, from linguistics, from second language acquisition. That knowledge was what made you a good teacher. But often, usually, and it goes back to the 19th century, accompanying that knowledge was knowledge of how to teach, or what we could call pedagogical knowledge. Now, what's interesting about these two kinds of ideas is that they're very prescriptive. They tell you what you should do, what you need to know. They don't actually describe what you do know when you act. So in the late 1980s, a third idea about what teachers know became very popular from the work of a Stanford professor, Lee Shulman, and it was called pedagogical content knowledge. Pedagogical content knowledge focuses on the knowledge that you use in the act of teaching. So pedagogical content knowledge became descriptive. Where the first two forms of knowledge were prescriptive, this one was descriptive. Okay, so we have disciplinary knowledge, we have pedagogical knowledge, we have pedagogical content knowledge. Let's see how you're doing. just take a minute with whoever you're next to and match. There are 2 examples of disciplinary knowledge, 2 examples of pedagogical or teaching knowledge, and 2 examples of pedagogical content knowledge, PCK, the last one. Go ahead, match them up. See if you can do this task. So what's an example up here on the left-hand side of disciplinary knowledge? Grammar, exactly. And what's another one? Second language acquisition. We good? What about teaching knowledge, pedagogical knowledge? What's an example there? Classroom management techniques, teaching methods. So the last 2 are examples of PCK, of pedagogical content knowledge, the knowledge you use in the work of teaching. And you might notice what's interesting, look how many more words we need to express those ideas than grammar. In other words, the complexity of what we know as teachers is hard to put words around sometimes. So these are 2 examples of pedagogical content knowledge. Well, those 3 ways of thinking about what teachers know, content knowledge, teaching knowledge, and then pedagogical content knowledge, really satisfied us for quite a while until, I would say, about 10 years ago. And at that point, we became interested in a new generation, a new way of thinking about what teachers need to know or do know when they teach. So we had, as I said, content knowledge from the academic disciplines. We're not different. Biology teachers know biology. Math teachers know math. We know something about the grammar, the linguistics, the phonology of our subject language. Then we had how to teach it. So we have methodology. We have practicum courses. We have ways that we prepare teachers to know how to teach. And then, as I said, those 2 prescriptions didn't really describe how we acted as teachers, so we went to the 3rd generation of pedagogical content knowledge, how I use what I know in the act of teaching. Then we got to where we are now, knowledge for teaching, my answer to why teachers tend to be knowledge users and not knowledge makers. Because knowledge for teaching is the knowledge that you make as a teacher in your work. Let me show you a trick, and I worked very hard on this. Look what happens to the disciplinary content. It's still there. Look what happens to the teaching. It's still there. What changes between the 3rd and the 4th generation? The content becomes teaching. And I want to say to you, that's a big deal. That is a big change, because when the content becomes teaching, when what you know is teaching, that means that you are positioned to be a knowledge maker if you choose to use that position. So we moved from defining what teachers know, knowing how to use that to teach, the how-to of it with particular students in particular contexts, to knowledge for teaching, which moved us into what I would call why-to. In other words, what is the purpose? Why am I doing this? What am I trying to accomplish? So those ways of looking at knowledge get us at the first part of my question of how teachers use what they know. I want to take you inside this idea of knowledge for teaching now. And I'm going to take you inside it in a different area, not in our area of language, but in an area that we all know something about, mathematics. But I'm going to take you inside it, the knowledge for teaching elementary mathematics, the knowledge for teaching that a primary school teacher generally has of elementary school mathematics. Now you might say, why are we doing math? Why can't we do language? Well, there's two reasons. One is, this is the area we've done the most research on. And my colleagues at the University of Michigan, Deborah Ball and her team has done an enormous amount of work in this area, not so much in other areas. The second is because when we go into a different area, we see this a whole lot easier than when we see it in our own field. Okay, so it's going to make you do a little work now to keep you awake after our delicious lunch. What's the answer to that math problem? No fair using your phone. See if you can do it in your head. I hope you got the answer 1,000. Come on, people. 225. Are we okay? No, you don't trust me? Do it on your phone then, if you need to. Is that right? Did we get it right? Okay. So we need to all understand the answer of this is 1,225. This is a problem that in Vietnam, what, grade 3 students, grade 4 students would probably, grade 3. So grade 3 students who are about 9 years old would need to know how to do this problem. All right, so what I'm going to show you in just a minute is 3 ways that students get this problem wrong. 3 things that they do wrong. And I'm going to ask you to study one of the 3 and try to figure out what they did. So, the 3 ways are labeled A, B, and C. Who's going to look at A? Put your hand up if you want to look at A. You don't know what you're going to see. Okay, you folks are looking at A. Who wants to look at B? Well, everyone else is going to look at C. All right, let's do it again. Who wants to look at A? Let's have about a third. More people. A. Come on, get your hands up. Good. B. Who wants to look at B? More people for B. Good. And C, I guess the rest of you have got C. Here's what you don't do. Don't look at all of them. Choose one of them and focus on it. Okay. Here, what I want you to think about is how did the student get this answer? And more importantly, what does the answer show you, or the mistakes that they make, tell you about what they know? All of these answers are wrong. That's not the point. The point is, what can you learn from them? Okay. A's, go ahead. B's, go ahead. C's, go ahead. Take a minute. You can talk to a partner. Do whatever you want. Figure out what the student did to get the answer and what the errors tell you about what they know about mathematics. Go ahead, please. You can think about these as 3 riddles. They're very interesting riddles. Can you figure it out? Did you get one? Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Can you figure it out? Only C. Okay, so try another one. C is a good one. Yeah, good. Okay, so what happened in A? What's going on in A? Anybody figure out A? What did the student, the 3rd grade student, do in A? Did that baffle everyone? If you say it out loud, it will help you. Read, I don't know, this doesn't work. Read the part that's down below the line here. How do you read this if you read it that way? It's not 405. What is it? it's 45. So look, here's what happened here. The student did 9 times 5, and they got 45. They did 2 times 9, and they got 18. So do you see, they understand quite a lot, but they don't understand how to put the 2 digits together. So they added it together and got a correct answer for adding their mistake. So what we have here is the student doesn't understand place value. They don't understand you write a 1 and an 8, not 10 and 8. If you're writing it in Chinese, you would write it exactly the way they wrote it there. Okay, what about 2? Anybody figure out this one? What happened here? Yeah. So they used 9 to multiply the 25. Ah, look at this, yes. So they did 9 times 25, and they got 225, and they did 4 times 25, and they got 100. And then they added them together. Again, this is a common problem that grade 3 kids have. They reverse the order that you're supposed to do things in. All right, last one. What happened over here? Anybody figure this one out? This may not be a technique that's taught in Vietnam schools, but it's certainly taught in American schools in other countries. The kid was taught to estimate. So they were taught to do 50 times 25, right? And then what they forgot to do was they didn't take away the extra 25, and so they ended up with that answer. So this is what we would call a problem-solving strategy that was taught to students. So what we have here is examples of the 3 kinds of knowledge. The teacher needs to know about content. That's how you understand place value. The teacher needs to know about reversals, because you have to understand how you teach it to make sure students don't reverse the order of multiplication. And the teacher needs some strategies or techniques for teaching how you do multiplying big numbers. So these 3 kinds of knowledge give us the map for knowledge of teaching in mathematics. We have disciplinary knowledge, we have pedagogical knowledge, and we have pedagogical content knowledge. So far, okay. Now let's just look at the second thing I asked you to think about, which is what these errors tell us about what the students know. In every case, they know there is something called place value here, but they don't represent it right. They know that you have to relate 2 lines, but they get it backwards. They know that there's a strategy there. They just did the wrong thing with the extra 25. I hate it when that happens. So you can say, if you look at these 3 problems, they each give us a window into the student's thinking. That's what knowledge for teaching is about. It's how we look into the student's learning in order to understand the teaching that we're doing. Okay, so that's what I want to say essentially about how teachers use what they know. They use it in 3 ways. It's disciplinary knowledge. In mathematics, we saw an example of place value. In our field, it's grammar, it's lexis, it's topics. They use it to support student learning through the methodology they use. Reversals. We know that our students often drop the 3rd singular S, both in writing and sometimes in speaking, and they use it to work in particular situations with students. Pedagogical content knowledge. Estimation strategies there, but think of what Professor Stoller worked with us on this morning in the plenary, were many pedagogical strategies that have been built out of how students learn to read, and these are techniques that will support them in doing that. So let's go to the second part of my phrase, the part of how teachers do what they do. Now remember, both of these parts of the phrase are responding to my question, why do language teachers use other people's ideas? And they're responding to my argument that we use other people's ideas because we think of ourselves not so much as knowledge generators or makers, but as knowledge users. So here I want to take you into two ways that we orient our work as teachers. Two ways that we set things up. And what I'm going to do is to, in just a minute, show you a picture. These two ways illustrate seeing teaching as therapeutic work, I would say, or seeing it as diagnostic work. When we see it as therapeutic work, we're concerned with how to fix things. So when we orient our work as teachers toward fixing what students don't know, we're actually taking a therapeutic orientation, whereas when we take a diagnostic orientation, we're interested in how can we figure out what they are thinking? How could we figure out how those students were confused, what it was about reversals or place value that got them confused? And we're investigating ways of addressing that confusion. So we're trying to figure out what the cause of the confusion is. Therapeutic work tries to fix it. Diagnostic work tries to understand it. So let me show you this image. And what I want you to do is to just, when you see this, what's the first thought that comes into your mind? What's your first reaction? It's upside down. It's backwards. It's upside down. But it's not upside down, is it? Why is this picture upside down? Because we're used to having it the other way around. So the reason our work as teachers is oriented to fixing things is because that's the way the social dynamic of teaching has been set up. There's nowhere is it written that we have to take a therapeutic orientation. We can be concerned with a diagnostic one. We simply have to unlearn some of the ideas that have gotten in the way of our being makers of knowledge. So I'm going to talk through three things that I think have contributed to us assuming that the map has to be this way, and when we see it this way, we see it upside down. Assuming that our work as teachers has to be about fixing things, a therapeutic view, and not about understanding things, which is a diagnostic view. So here are the three things that I want to talk about. I'm going to talk about the classroom and the two ways that we tend to orient ourselves in the classroom as teachers. One toward a therapeutic fixing orientation and another toward a diagnostic or understanding orientation. Then I'm going to talk about the plot. In other words, what is it we're trying to get done? Sometimes called the culture of teaching. And again, what orients us toward a therapeutic or a diagnostic view? And finally, the players, the teacher and students, and the social agreement that holds them together. So I'm going to argue that these three things together create the classroom in which we want to become knowledge makers. But to do that, we're going to have to change our orientation, and each of these three things gives us a choice to make that change. So here's the first one, the classroom. In the classroom, we tend to see ourselves and our job as being about the content. If I plan well, I do a good job of planning my lessons, my students will learn what it is that I'm teaching. But what if we reorient and we say, what if my job isn't the content, but my students' learning. And content is subordinate or second to my students' learning. So my job is really not to just plan and transmit, but to develop a real question of why is this happening? What's going on? Why are these kids having a hard time or an easy time with what I'm teaching? Number one is a therapeutic view. Number two, a diagnostic one. Now, let's go to the plot. My job as a teacher in a therapeutic view is to know. So when mistakes happen, rather than being windows into what's going on, like our kids with math, they're things to jump over. Oops, won't ever do that again. That was a bad idea. Won't try that way of doing it. So rather than seeing these trip-ups, these mistakes that happen in our teaching as a way in to diagnosing and understanding learning, we see them as problems with our job of making learning happen. But what if we shift it and say, actually, our job isn't to drive the train, but to be part of it, to engage with students and contributing to their learning? The problem with the plot is that we have sold a big lie. And our big lie is that teaching causes learning. It doesn't cause learning. You don't make anybody learn anything as a teacher. You create possibilities in which they can learn something. So in number two, if you function as an acknowledger, you recognize I'm part of it, but I'm not the one who's making it happen. What's this mean for the players, the roles? A longtime friend of mine and colleague who some of you may know, he's now retired from the University of Lancaster, Dick Allwright. Anybody know Dick? I know some people know Dick here. Dick did a lot of work with students in Algeria and Morocco and in the North Africa. And he identified in classrooms something he called the Covert Conspiracy. And the Covert Conspiracy is, oh, if we're having a good time in this class, we must be learning something. Right? If everyone's getting along, everyone's enjoying it, it must be a good class. So the social compact I want to suggest when we look at it from the point of view of therapeutic orientation, of thinking, of fixing things, is that my job is to make learning happen. I teach, and you, the students, will learn what I teach. So if I'm enjoying what you're doing, then I must be learning what you're teaching. Maybe not. What if we look at it from a diagnostic point of view and we say, my job isn't to make it happen. My job is to facilitate, engage, mediate, use whatever verb you want to use. But my job is to be in the middle of it, but I'm not driving the train. So I want to suggest these three views about the setting, the plot, and the players, about the classroom, the way the culture of teaching operates in our classrooms, and the social compact that if we're having a good time, we're learning something. If we're enjoying something, it's teaching me something. Those three ideas, I want to say, contribute to this way that we do what we do. The setting organizes it around content. The plot organizes it around knowing. And the characters or the roles or the players organize it around, as long as we're getting along, this is being beneficial. We need to break that if we want to stop using other people's ideas and shift into a role of being knowledge makers and not knowledge users. So let me pull this together then. What I've suggested about how we do what we do is that there are two orientations that we are caught between. A therapeutic one, which emphasizes knowing the content as a teacher. I can only fix the problem if I know the content better than you. Versus a diagnostic one, which is to say, I know something about how people learn, but I don't know how you learn, so I'm going to have to figure that out as I work with you and all the yous in my class. So that in a diagnostic orientation, teaching happens because, or learning happens because of teaching. It's an and. Whereas in a diagnostic one, rather, we engage with learning, and that's what leads teachers to support learners in what they do. The left-hand side is really about using knowledge, about being a knowledge user. The right-hand side is really about making knowledge, about being a knowledge generator. So let me wind this up. My answer to why we use or need to use other people's ideas in teaching is that because we don't use our own. And we don't use our own because we don't focus on making knowledge out of the work that we do. And I've suggested that there are a couple of things that are getting in the way of us taking on that role. The first is that we need to take a diagnostic orientation. We need to look at the players, the two faces, and not the vase in between. The second is that we assume a lot. We take things for granted. We decide that the map has to be up that way and not this way. And the third is that we don't ask questions about how students are learning the content, why they're making the mistakes they're making, and most importantly, what do those mistakes tell us? So, maybe not an easy answer after lunch, but that's my answer to my question. That in order to shift to using our own ideas about teaching, we're really going to have to shift the way we do the work. We're going to have to shift it to diagnosis and investigation and away from therapy and fixing. A good doctor does not assume that they know the disease. They have to figure out what it is. Why do we assume we know how the language works when I don't know how you're learning it? It's you that are doing that work. We're going to need to do that to unlearn a lot of stuff that has been kind of put into us as we've become teachers and speakers of a language. One of the main things we're in the middle of unlearning right now, which came up this morning and in other contexts, the notion of nativeness, that there is a native speaker of a language. That's an idea we're unlearning and saying, as one of the introductions said this morning, that really people use language in many ways. And the idea of some people being born to use it and other people learning to use it is maybe got the map upside down. We need to focus on how people use it. And the third thing we have to do is really engage in what the mistakes are in our classes. That means teaching in a way that students can make mistakes so we can figure out what's going on. When you go to a doctor, why does the doctor listen to your chest with a stethoscope? Because they want to hear what's going on. Why do they put you on a treadmill? To see if you'll pass out. They want to see how good your heart is. We need to organize toward diagnosis. So let me leave you with a last idea, quote, statement. This comes from a former professor of mine, a woman named Eleanor Duckworth. There are two things you should know about this person before you read this quote. The first is that she was the translator of the psychologist Jean Piaget into English. So she worked with Piaget in Geneva, and then she subsequently translated his work into English, and the rest is history, as we say. It became very influential because his ideas became very widespread. The second thing is that this quote from Professor Duckworth came from an essay that she was asked to write about the discipline of ways of doing things. She was asked to write about the value of knowing the right way of doing something. This was in the context of a book on testing. So when you take a test, do you know the right way to solve the math problem or do you just know how to solve it? Do you know the right way to write a sentence, or do you know how to write a sentence that someone can understand? Here's what Professor Duckworth said, and it's kind of an interesting riddle in the way she wrote it. She said, what you know about what you do about what you don't know is what shapes ultimately what you know. So I want to leave you with the idea that if we focus always on what we know, what we're sure of, and making that better, we're missing the boat, missing the train, and we're not really engaging in developing our own ideas about teaching and learning and language and how they function in our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Deunan Freeman, for your enlightening lecture and presentation. Now I would like to invite the audience to ask questions and comment or show your interest. And I would invite you to stay on the stage to provide some answers to the audience. In the meantime, I would like to invite you to use some water as well, because, you know, we don't use plastic bottle anymore. We use this environment-friendly bottle. Yes, any comments, ideas, questions, please? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your very engaging and inspiring presentation. And I think there's a lot for us to learn from your presentation as the role of the teacher. My thesis is on language policy. And while listening to your presentation, I'm thinking a lot about what could be the message for policymakers and curriculum developers. Because I know that the curriculum and also what we have to teach really influence the process of making knowledge for learning. So I wonder if you could comment on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. So I think we need to think about a top-down and a bottom-up way of working. Too often we work top-down, and teachers are the recipients, so they have to use the ideas they're given. Now, I'm not suggesting the opposite, that only bottom-up will work. Because if my child goes to school here in Hue, I want them to learn more or less the same things that your child going to school in Hanoi or in Ho Chi Minh City are learning, or in another part of Vietnam. There needs to be some level of standardization. So I think what we've got to think about is the space in between the top-down and the bottom-up. And what we found in some of the research we've done in the Learning for Teaching project is that the top-down provides the policy-scape, the landscape of ideas, and the bottom-up provides the localization and use of those ideas. So that's, I think, why in many countries, and I understand to some degree here in Vietnam too, we use devices in the middle like action research, like exploratory practice, in order to have teachers work with the ideas from the policy-scape and localize them in their context. Good question.
Thank you. Thank you for the first question. And any other comments or ideas? Questions, please?
Got one there.
Yes, please. Would you please introduce yourself a bit before you throw the question? Thanks.
Maybe just use your big voice.
sorry. I think you
How
should
do
do the mic.
I heard it, I think. Adam, are you saying how would you assess?
Yeah. Whoa, excuse me. How would you assess this in this model? Like, how would you assess the learning for the students and the teachers actually being effective?
Yeah. Another good question. Before I respond to it, let me back up. I wouldn't say what I've said is a model. I would say it's actually the way things operate. We just pretend they don't. So that's why we think that the map should be this way. But in fact, the map could be this way equally well. So it's really important that we recognize we're being lived by ideas rather than creating them ourselves. And that's my overall argument. So to the point of assessment, I think that the movements that we begin to see in many places here in Vietnam as well as others toward more project-based work, more integration of language into doing particular kinds of tasks, content learning and language activities, all of those show the way in which the learner is using the language and probably gives us a range of issues like we saw in math. So it isn't just to generate an answer, but it's to do something. And in doing something, we see, oh, okay, here's where the problem lies. That's the way I think we get the data in assessment. And my friend and colleague, Nick Saville, knows a lot more about this, and he'll talk more about it tomorrow, I'm sure. But all I would say is that then once we have that data, the challenge becomes how do we represent it as a score, as a grade? And that's very much about the last three things I said, the social ideas of our work. A grade of A or 95 doesn't say you know anything. It simply is a name we put on a performance that you gave. So.
Yes, please. The next question.
So as your example showed, not all students do the same thing wrong.
Yes, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so if you address each of these mistakes that they make,
right.
You could go on for 3 weeks on the same topic of trying to correct it, and you have to live with a certain...
You've got to keep going.
Yes,
yep.
a certain curriculum, a certain time frame of how much time you can spend on this topic, not just, okay, now every single person here got it and all of their mistakes are addressed. You can't do that, so what do you suggest?
Well, first of all, I think your point is very well taken, but possibly not entirely the case. Those three kinds of mistakes that I showed are archetypal mistakes kids make in math. And if a teacher's being trained as a primary teacher of mathematics, they now learn about, okay, kids could reverse. They could make a mistake when they estimate. They could not understand place value. We do the same thing when we prepare teachers in our pre-service preparation. We teach them the kinds of errors that students can make. What we don't ask them to do is use that diagnostically. So the first issue is, I think, we've got it there, but we're not using it in a way that's effective. The second is that honestly, when you got a class of 40 people, you got to go with the most common stuff you can deal with. But that doesn't mean that the map is right side up or upside down. Don't assume you know what everyone's having a hard time with. So this connects the last two questions. When we developed the assessments in English for teaching, we had a big argument about whether or not they were going to be discrete point tests or bands. And I said they've got to be bands. You understand, like the IELTS. Because you really need to know, like a frequent flyer program, where are you? Are you gold, silver, or platinum, or whatever? Rather than, do I have exactly this answer? When we approach students as having discrete problems, I think we're looking at discrete answers. When we're looking for patterns, we're looking for banded kind of ways in which we can understand.
I see.
Is that?
So addressing the band would take less time.
Yeah,
Okay.
You look at a lesson and you can say, I'm pretty sure this is where problems are going to occur.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you. And yes.
Oh, one more.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I think what we discussed so far relate quite a lot to what is called assessment for learning in teaching, and that is something that we need to emphasize for teachers. So assessing should be a part of the teaching,
Yes.
and you are not going to teach what the content only, but you also have to pay attention to the student learning and how they get to know that. So not only what they know, but how they get to know that in order to adjust your teaching in a suitable way to facilitate the learning.
Absolutely.
It should be, it should be something which is still the base pedagogy. But so far we focus more on transmitting the knowledge from teacher to the student.
Right.
But now we pay attention to creating, I think, a kind of environment for the learning to take place.
Right.
So it's not only, so like you said, it's not only you teach that the student learn,
Right.
but how you teach to
Right.
help the student to learn something.
So your comment is exactly right, and I just call attention to two things. Look, you said we move away from transmitting knowledge, 2 words, to creating an environment in which learning can take place, 8 words. It's exactly like what we saw with pedagogical content knowledge. When we shift the way we look at the work, we need new language, new ways of talking about it. Assessment for learning is a shorthand for a complicated idea, in the same way that transmitting information became a shorthand for was a complicated idea. But the second thing I want to just say to your comment is, we teach other people's children. And in teaching other people's children, how the assessment works out is of interest not just to the child, but to the parents, to the grandparents, to the community. I think for assessment for learning to really take root, we have a lot more social work to do in schools to say, it's not the way you were tested. We're doing this in a different way, and here's the benefit for you and your children.
Yes, so it returned to the very first question about the policy. That the policy dealing not only with the teacher,
Right.
but dealing with, actually we have to deal with quite a lot of factors relating to the context, where people pay more attention to the end of the learning result rather than how they make it.
Exactly.
So the policy, I mean, must address more than just the teacher and the student.
It has to be much broader.
Make the understanding for even the children and the parents need to know that there is something else that they need to do, not only the teacher's job.
Well, that there is something else there, yes.
Yeah.
But let me just say, and I know we're almost out of time, if we look around the world, either because smarter people than me and us have figured this out, or by dumb luck, somebody has tripped on a good answer, we find these devices that happen in educational systems that do exactly what you say. One example is Finland, which is held at the highest of OECD and other rating on PISA and other things. The Finnish educational system, about 20 years ago, in middle school and high school, started looping. Do you know looping? It means you would start with your English students in middle school and you would stay with them all the way through high school. You wouldn't just have them for 1 year or 2 years, you'd have them for 6 years. Well, if you're a student, that could be deadly. Maybe it isn't, I don't know. But think what it does for the teacher. It changes the way you have to think about what you teach. Because I have this span of time. It changes how the family interacts because I'm not going to go away. I'm here for 6 years. So it changed the whole social work of teaching. That wasn't really why they did it. They did it for staffing reasons. It was easier to staff that way.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm suggesting is we need to, you know the phrase, think outside the box, and there are other places that we can take ideas that will help us with that.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. We still have about 5 minutes for, I think I suggest that we last questions for Professor Freeman. Yes, please.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. and I think it's very inspiring. My name is Tam, and I'm working with an education technology company. And when hearing the questions of teachers of how actually teachers can focus on diagnostics in a classroom with limitation of time and always very like standardized curriculum, I'm thinking of like models that technology can help in this way, because right now technology with like flipped model classroom can actually give teachers and students more time to practice and to do activities with one another in the class time, and like empower teachers more. So
absolutely.
I think this is something that a good idea to
yes,
implement.
yeah. No, I'm completely in agreement with you that technology will help a lot of what we're talking about. But not to end on a down note, but the problem is we often think about technology with the same old ideas that we've thought about everything else. So we actually don't let it do what it could do. And there was a pretty well-known cognitive psychologist at Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the 1970s when computers were just getting started, a man named Seymour Papert. And he said, you know what we should do? We should bring in 5-year-olds and put them in front of these machines and see what they do. This is way before Apple, way before swiping, way before all the things that are part of our lives now. But he was right in the sense that we will never understand technology by having grown-ups like me trying to figure out what to do with it. We need to let people who don't have the map being upside down in their head do things with it. So I think many of the most productive uses of technology are when they're in the hands of learners within a set of parameters or guidelines. But I agree with you very much. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, thank you. So I think it comes to the end of our second plenary presentation today. So thank you very much for your presentation today, Professor Deunan Freeman. And as an acknowledgement of your contribution to the convention, I would like to invite Professor Nguyễn Hoa to present the gifts and certificates for Professor Deunan Freeman. Yes.
We can shake hands.
Where is the certificate?
Wait for it. That's okay. We can talk for a minute. Yeah. Ah, here we go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The flowers from Alata.
Oh, they're gorgeous. Thank you, thank you, thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Once again, thank you very much. And now we will be moving around, and we will have a poster 15-minute workshop.